The next thing we want to look at is what happens to a long levered margin position over time. And over time, three things are going to happen. The first thing that's going to happen is the stock price is going to change. And we're going to describe this as a capital gain or capital loss rating, percent change. And so a $50 stock that has a 10% capital gain increase is going to go to 55. We could describe it as a dollar change, a $5 change, but we're going to choose to describe it as a percent change, and we'll see why. The second thing is that dividends are paid. And the dividend rate will be expressed as a percentage of the initial price, meaning that if it's a $50 stock and it pays a 2% dividend, then the dividend will be $1 per year. Now, technically, it's going to be 25 cents each quarter, but we're going to pretend that it is a dollar per year. And we're always going to express the dividend rate as a percentage of the initial price. And so a 2% dividend on a $50 stock, even if the stock price goes to $55, because it's a 10% change in stock price, the dividend is still the $1, the 2% on the 50, not the 2% on the 55. And then the loan, the money that we have borrowed from the broker, this accrues interest at the margin loan rate. And if you click these links, you can see that this is going to be somewhere north of 6% and possibly as high as 10%. Now remember that the brokerage firm borrows at something called the call money rate. Remember, these are brokers' calls. And the difference, and this is about 2%. And so the difference, this 4.5% to almost 8% difference, this spread is the brokerage firm's profit from you borrowing money to buy stock on margin. And just to make this really, really simple, we will always assume that all three of these are annual rates, and we will always do this in a 1-year time period. In reality, these things are accrued daily, except for the dividend, and so it gets a little bit more complicated, but the intuition is going to be the same doing what we're doing. It's just going to make some of the math easier. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume that there are three rates: the rate at which the stock price changes, the rate at which you receive cash from holding the stock, and the rate at which interest accrues on the loan. All three of these will always be expressed as annual rates for our purposes. In reality, it's different, and we'll always do a 1-year time period. Again, reality is different. So that's the setup for this. Let's look at an example of a dynamic or over time long levered return. So here's the example. An investor puts up $70,000 and buys 1,000 shares of $100 stock. Okay, so let's look at the position. Calculate the total assets, the liabilities at the beginning of the year. We know the equity is going to be $70,000 because that's how much the investor puts up. And so the cash is going to go away. The investor is going to buy 1,000 shares of $100 stock, and so $100,000 in assets. They have $70,000 in equity, therefore the loan must be $30,000. And remember how this works. I put $70,000 in the account. I go to the little buy page in my brokerage account, and I buy $100,000 worth of stock, and the broker says, okay, you only got 70, I guess I'm lending you 30. So let's calculate the initial margin rate. And again, we're just going to use that same formula, which is the equity divided by the position value. And so, okay, we're buying at 70% margin. Perfect. That's greater than 50, so that's allowed. And what I want to do is calculate the margin call price if a margin call happens at 30%. And we will always assume that a margin call happens in 30% in this class. I'm not going to play games with 30 or 35. But some brokers will actually set a higher margin call rate than 30%. They can't set it lower than 30 by rule, but they can say, you know, you're a small trader. We don't really know you. We don't necessarily trust you. We're going to have a margin call at 35 or 40, but we will always assume in this class 30. So we're going to assume the price change happens immediately, so there's no interest, no dividend, and we plug in this same formula, the loan divided by shares times 1 minus the 30% margin rate that I plug in, and I get $42.86. Let's be careful. The price was the price was $100. It has now dropped, and now I have a margin call. The price went down. My equity is lower. That makes sense. Okay. Over the next year, let's look at our three different interest rates. The stock price return will be 10%. The dividend yield will be 4%, and the margin loan rate will be 6%. Again, these are going to be annualized rates, and we're going to have the period be 1 year. So dividend cash at the end of the year, we have 1,000 shares at $100 a share. We've express the dividend yield as a percentage of the initial price, and so that's going to be $4,000 in cash. The stock is going to increase by 10%, and so the stock is going to go from $1,000 shares times $100. It's going to be $110,000 worth of stock. And so my total assets is the cash and the $110,000 worth of stock. My total assets is $114,000. The loan was $30,000, but I'm being charged 6% interest, and so that's going to be $31,800. And so my equity is going to be the $114,000 in assets minus the $31,800, and so I'm going to have $82,200 in equity. Let's calculate the total return for the stock and the total return for the equity. Now, I want to be careful here about terminology. Return on equity is a reserved term in finance that means net income over equity. It is a corporate finance term. I will attempt to always use equity return as opposed to return on equity and stock return, just to not be confusing. Again, ROE, or return on equity, is a reserved term in finance. It's for financial statement analysis. It means net income over equity. Here I'm going to talk about not return on equity, but equity return, and that's just percent change in equity. And so the stock went from 100 to 110, plus I got $4 in cash, and so that's 14%. But I can just add these two rates. I can add the 10% and the 4% to get 14%, and that's why we express it that way. The equity return is going to be $82,200 divided by the $70,000 I started with, and so here is 17.43%. And this is what we need to do to build our model. Once we build our model, we can start playing with some of these numbers to see how these levered positions work.